We're talking today with Tina Turner, who is a recent graduate of the University of Alabama. She's going to tell us about a story that she covered as a student reporter for Alabama Public Radio, which is our largest public radio news network in the state of Alabama. Tina, thank you so much for taking time to share with us today. Talk about, first of all, your work as a student at the University of Alabama. What different things have you done as a reporter here at the University of Alabama?
Yes, well, I'm happy to speak with you and talk about my time at UA, which, you know, it was extremely beneficial to me because they have so many opportunities there if you're a student wanting to pursue media or news media. So I started working as a freshman at the college at the campus radio station, WVUA 90.7. And I was an host for my own show there called The College Struggle. And then I moved up and became a digital media director and then a program director and eventually the station manager my senior year. And during that time, I was also working at Alabama Public Radio, where I was a student reporter. And there were so many opportunities that came from working at Alabama Public Radio because they're right next to the CPT, which is their local news station, kind of like a PBS vibe, which is what I'm doing now. And I got to do some work with television there, but at Alabama Public Radio is really where I got to learn so many skills and show my skills and develop my skills. And so the story we're talking about today with human trafficking is where I really learned probably the most when it came to recording sound, interviews, and just how to be a good interviewer. Because the skills like that came with being a good interviewer.
We've heard the term human trafficking. Let's make sure that our readers and our viewers know, what is human trafficking?
Okay, so the understanding that I took away from working with that piece is human trafficking is when someone is being exploited for their work. So that could be labor, that could be sex work, and anyone who is basically taken by force and barely paid anything. Honestly, it's a different form of slavery, of modern day slavery. And so that was obviously a very touchy subject to talk about with people who experience those types of situations. And I was speaking with people who were even more marginalized. They were obviously already being trafficked and they had rights and freedoms taken away. But then the people I spoke to were specifically LGBTQ folk or people who are helping LGBTQ folk in Alabama.
Now, the occasion for the story was an event that was going on. You were in Tuscaloosa at the university, but you were assigned to cover an event in Montgomery. Tell us about that event.
So I believe it was at the beginning of 2019, or yes, that a transgender woman in Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama, was murdered. And Alabama does not consider any LGBTQ murdering, basically, a hate crime. And so this visual was to bring awareness to that. And it was obviously to remember the woman who'd passed away. And it was just to have the LGBTQ community come out and show their face and show that this is a problem that we're facing, because Alabama was the first state to have a murder of a transgender woman in the United States in 2019.
Now that I did not understand. So Alabama has that distinction as a not so welcoming place for the trans community.
That's right.
And in this case, you had a trans woman, which can be more challenging, but particularly women of color.
That's right. So across the United States, you'll hear more recently how transgender women of color are the most marginalized group in America. They're the most murdered group in America. Um, and some states do see, uh, do recognize hate crimes to this group, but like I said, Alabama doesn't. So I learned a lot just about Alabama, just working with this story.
And so in this story, there were people speaking at this remembrance of the person who lost her life, but also there were stories that they were sharing. And what kind of, and you're doing a radio piece, so you're looking
Mhm.
for sound bites. What kind of sound would a person with a recorder have been able to gather from that event?
Yeah, so there was a big turnout there. A group of moms there who were there to support LGBTQ families and kids. Um, so I spoke with a lot of people holding signs and banners who were showing support, and I asked them, "What does your sign say?" And they would tell me if sometimes it was just the name of the organization. Sometimes it was some sort of short support phrase, I guess, on their sign. Um, I went up to people and asked them why they were there or why they felt they needed to be there. And so it was a lot of sound uh, from just common folk who were there, but it was also sound of the actual ceremony. So I got to hear from a potential interviewee, Darnisha Duncan. She was basically the keynote speaker there, and she had a lot to say about, because she herself is a black transgender woman, so she had a lot to say about the subject, and she had great sound. And um, there was other people there, part of the LGBTQ community that I spoke with later, who told me a lot about what Montgomery, Alabama is doing on this topic of recognizing um, hate crimes and how they're trying to make it more known. But um, my story was selling kids, LGBTQ folk in the Bible Belt. So that so just LGBTQ and Bible Belt are things that obviously contrast. So it like I said, I was always learning whenever I was covering this story.
So that particular event had people telling their stories, including the keynote speaker. But then in Alabama, that's the Montgomery, that's the state capital. You
Mhm.
had this keynote speaker who actually has a center, but that's almost 2 hours away in Birmingham.
Mhm.
And you came back to Birmingham and did some additional interviewing. Is that right?
Yep, yep. So after the ceremony, I went up and spoke to her and got her information. And she gave me the information to go to her center in Alabama. And when I did that, we spoke for a while about her experience when she was younger, and how she does not claim that she was a victim of trafficking. She was a sex worker, and she has the argument that sex work is real work because people in marginalized groups, people because of her race, because of her gender, she there was no way for her to get money. She wasn't basically a respected person in the community that she was in. So I spoke to her about that, and she does take in children or younger folk who've experienced similar situations or are experiencing similar situations, people who actually are being trafficked. And so we spoke about that, and yeah, and it obviously, was hard to hear sometimes, but really it was just I needed the information. So despite like hearing some awful stories or some super surprising, shocking stories that I wasn't expecting to hear, um, I had to just, make sure I was really intentional with my listening skills and writing everything down, and, hearing what she had to say on the topic.
And then your story moved to Huntsville, which is in the Shoals or the northern part of the state. And there was
Mhm.
a woman there who you interviewed. She had an interesting story.
Yes. Um, Hers probably was the most heart wrenching of all because she was a victim of trafficking. And I believe her story of just tragedy in general started when she was a baby. But when she first began being trafficked, she was a runaway from home. Um, and she was 12 years old, I believe, or 13. And she ended up having to join a biker gang to protect herself, and she was being trafficked within that gang. And then her story just went on about awful things that happened to her as a child. And but now she is the head of an organization in Huntsville that protects people who were in situations like herself. And it's not just for Alabama; it's like the nation. It's worldwide. People will come to her home, and um, that's a place of like sanction for them. They are protected there, and they are provided resources to get them back on track.
It's tempting when you are doing broadcast reporting to remember that news value of the shock, the unusual, the bizarre, and we
Hmm.
focus on that typically in a story. But if I understand correctly, the Alabama Public Radio goal was not just to focus on the emotions around the horrors of being involved in human trafficking. You had a certain directive that your news director kind of gave you for the mission of the story. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So obviously, with a topic like human trafficking, you're going to hear some terrible things. But my news director really wanted to highlight how Alabama is really at the forefront in the nation with providing resources, not just um, to a certain group that's being trafficked, but everyone who's being trafficked. And people might forget that Alabama is like on this main, basically trafficking highway, like that people pass through. And so he just wanted to let people know that this is a state where you should be worried, but this is a state that has a lot of people working to stop something like human trafficking. And so, really, it was just about providing information and resources to people, and to let the state understand that this is something that we're working on, ending human trafficking in the state and protecting those who are victims of human trafficking.
But I'm also hearing maybe a second story that you heard in your interviews about what it's like to be in the LGBTQ community and
Hmm.
that experience, even in the choices of the lines of work and in the experience of living in a state that may not provide the same level of protection that other marginalized groups might be protected, but your news director is trying to focus on the human trafficking. How did you
Yes.
reconcile these kind of different stories that could easily have been told?
Yes. So as a student reporter, I was able to get a lot of coaching because I was extremely inclined to show like what I believed was the heart of the story, which was these tragedies that I was hearing about these women being trafficked, about the people they're helping being trafficked, and how their experience is different. And, some might even say worse from the stories I heard, I would say worse because they're LGBTQ. And because they're so young when they're coming into terms with their identity, and who they are, and are being sold. If they're a boy, being sold to men and women, if they're a girl, being sold to men and women, if there's transgender, being sold, a transgender man or woman being sold to different people, and just coming to terms with your identity within that, because these are people who are still human, and they are forgotten in the worst ways, and just treated in the worst ways. And so I was hearing all these stories, and I obviously wanted to focus on, or let that story be told, these stories of tragedy and whatnot. But it was something that was going to um, become a bigger story, I suppose. And I had to remain focused on the goal. Um, and we hear the word sensationalism tossed around a lot, and um, you know, this was maybe like a different form of sensationalism, because obviously there's a lot of emotion to this story, but it's all very true. Um, and I was afraid, if I, in the end, being coached through it, I was afraid that in the end, if I, used so much emotion from these stories, that you would just forget about the work that's actually being done, because that was the goal. Like I said, the intent was to show how far Alabama has come with ending human trafficking and sex trafficking and things like that.
Our ethics code talks about minimizing harm. And in that area of minimizing harm, you're concerned about those who we often characterize as vulnerable populations. And we also want to get the story, but we want to not harm our subject while we're getting the story. How would you say you uh, put that into action in the interview process, in the story gathering process?
Yes, well, it was certainly a learning process because this was the first time I was covering such hard news in a feature length form. Because at Alabama Public Radio, I would do cut and copies a lot, and that's really about like 2 3 minute pieces on shorter news stories. But this time, I had the opportunity to sit down for like 2 hours sometimes with people and hear their full story. But when it came to trying to minimize that harm, uh, whenever I was hearing these people, and for myself, I had to just block it off and say, um, I have to remain professional, even though I'm a student and a student reporter and learning. Like there is a form of professionalism I have to attain, and to not let them get to a point where they're too emotional in telling their story and can't go on anymore with telling it, because like I said, at the end of the day, the goal was to talk about the resources and information. And if I would have become too overwhelmed myself and wasn't able to remain professional in that situation, I wouldn't have gotten my story.
There's also an expectation as an ethical journalist that you show compassion. And
Mhm.
I'm curious if you found that that was necessary in many of your decisions in telling the story, from what sound bites you selected, to even using things that might have been great newsworthy elements, but may not have reflected compassion.
Yes. So there was there was hours and hours of um, audio that I had to leave out. The piece itself ended up being about 8 minutes long, and sometimes you can hear, especially the woman from Huntsville, when she talks about her story, she's told it a whole bunch of times, so she's not really getting choked up. But it's whenever she talks about the children she's been working with. It's whenever, and there might be points in the piece where you can kind of hear it, but that's where you can hear her get really impassioned. She was like, I can't, she'll talk about, you can't believe how some people treat these children. Yes, they're LGBTQ. Yes, they're not like you. Yes, they may not have come from the same place you've come, but they're still kids. They're still human, and they should be treated with that same kind of respect you'll give the next kid. And it it was moments like that I tried to keep in, because my story also involved the Bible Belt. But there was a lot of moments that you don't hear where it was like taking a breath, um, and just remembering that, like, the person I was interviewing um, needed to take some time to, like, not give so much energy to a certain subject, because that's not what she was here for. And I would want to hear more too. Whenever they would tell their stories, I'll be like, "Oh my goodness!" And then what happened next, and next. But then I was like, "Oh, we're getting too deep into this," and I'll have to give another question, because I came with a list of questions, and so I'd have to give another question that focused. There would be times where I'd like veered from my notebook, and then I would have to remember to get back on it, or else it would have been more hours added onto that conversation.
So that story was done in 2019,
Hmm.
and in 2020 you graduated from the University of Alabama. What
Hmm.
happened after you graduated?
So obviously I had to graduate during the pandemic. And so I was very nervous about how the job hunt would go, because um, I felt prepared to pursue news media, because I really enjoyed what I took away from Alabama, with whether it was a class and learning how to work with the camera, or it was with Alabama Public Radio or the campus station, music station. I very much enjoyed my experience at UA. And I was really nervous because the pandemic was happening, and I was reading all these articles about how students, like the fear for students going into this pandemic. But this was also an election year. So they there was definitely a need for young reporters to be, you know, covering the news at a time like this. It was a pandemic. Um, what's been happening, what happened at the beginning of the year or later on, I guess March or so, with George Floyd and things that followed with protests. There was a lot of news to be covered. So eventually, um, I was when I put myself out there in the beginning, I didn't see so many opportunities. But further along, I did, and I did a few interviews, and I ended up going with PBS NewsHour, PBS NewsHour, and I'm the inaugural Jim Lehrer Fellow there. Um, so yeah, that's how I get to represent UA, and I'm so excited because I do enjoy working in public media, and PBS is the best place to do that, obviously. Uh, so that's what I'm doing now, and uh, I'm working with post production. So after the show airs, I work with getting it up online, and I'm writing my own stories for online pieces, learning how to do stories on social media platforms with Instagram and Facebook and things like that. Yep. And then in January, I'll be moving to go work in the studio and run the board and see how the show really happens in real time.
So January 2021, you'll be going from what you're from, Louisiana. You were in
Hmm.
Tuscaloosa, and now you'll be going up to the nation's capital, right?
That's right. Yep.
All right. Well, Tina Turner, congratulations on all your accomplishments, of course, completing your degree program, starting your career, but also thank you for sharing your story about telling the story on Alabama Public Radio. We wish you the best of luck in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much.